Like I wrote these rules. Why did I write these rules? Well, you know, and especially when I said, well, you should try to improve yourself instead of trying to set the world straight, or instead of worrying about what other people are doing wrong. You might say, well, that's a hell of a thing for someone to say who just wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life. It's like, you know, but the thing is that I wasn't just writing that. I was writing that for me as much as for anyone else. And I mean I really mean that sincerely. You know, I had an opportunity to spend somewhere around 5 years meditating on how you should conduct yourself so that your life is what it could be. And like I'm in the group of people that I'm advising, you know what I mean? It's like all of these things are very difficult to stand up straight, to remember that, and to treat yourself like you're someone worthwhile, and to make friends with people who are good for you, and to tell the truth, or at least not to lie. I mean, these are all ideals, right? And especially taken as a whole, they constitute a kind of ideal, and you never attain the ideal. And not only that, it recedes as you approach it, right? Because you straighten yourself out and you think, well, I've got it now. And you think, no, wait a minute, there's more to go. There's still more to go. And then you get that much farther along the line, you think, oh, yeah, I thought this was the end of the road. It's like, no, there's plenty of imperfections left to iron out. And so it is a constant adjustment. But there's something about that that's also positive, because you might say that it's not so much that there isn't such a thing as a good person. It's that our idea of what constitutes good isn't right. Because a good person is someone who's trying to get better. And no matter how good you are, there's better that you can get, but the real goodness is in the attempt, right? It's in the process, to use somewhat of a cliche. You know, there's this, and I'll close with this, and it's a good way to close. You know, and this is a psychological observation. The central figure of Western culture is Christ. And we can look at that psychologically, because Christ is the dying and resurrecting hero. And what does that mean psychologically? Well, it means that you learn things painfully. And when you learn something painfully, a part of you has to die. That's the pain. You know, when a dream is shattered, for example, a huge part of you that constituted that dream, maybe even the biological substrate of that dream, has to be stripped away and burned. And so life is a constant process of death and rebirth. And to participate in that fully is to allow yourself to be redeemed by it. And so the good is that process of death and rebirth, voluntarily undertaken. It's like you're not as good as you could be, so you let that part of you die. And if someone comes along and says, you know, there's some dead wood here, man, it needs to be burned off. You think, well, that stuff's still a bit alive. When that burns, it's gonna hurt. It's like, yeah, well, no kidding. But maybe the thing that emerges in its place is something better. And I think this is the secret of human beings. This is what we're like, you know, unlike any other creature, is that we can let our old selves die and let our new selves be born. And that's what we should do. And so, where do I fall short in these 12 rules? Well, endlessly, because, well, here's a way of thinking about it. Until the entire world is redeemed, we all fall short. See, in the Soviet Union, when Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Soviet Union and its pathologies, it sort of peaked in terms of its pathological authoritarianism when it became illegal to complain that your life wasn't going well. And you just think about how horrible that is, eh? Because you know, lots of times your life isn't going well. I mean, and I don't mean this in some casual way. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe you have diabetes and you know, maybe you're going to lose your feet or something. Like, it's really not, it's nothing trivial that's going on here. Something is not good. Or maybe it's economic, or maybe you're unemployed, but you see, the idea in the Soviet Union was, well, we already have all the answers. Everything's perfect. Already. That's what totalitarians think. Well, if everything's perfect and you're suffering, then, well, maybe there's something wrong with you. Because everything is perfect after all, and if you're suffering, then, and what are you going to come out and say? Well, I'm suffering? It's like, well, then you're evidence that things aren't perfect, right? You're like a widow or an orphan in an Old Testament story, you know, when the kings got too high and mighty, then they wouldn't pay enough attention to the widows and the orphans, and then the prophet would come along and say, you know, those widows and orphans, they're a lot more important than you think they are, and if you don't pay attention to them properly, then things are going to fall apart around you in a way that you just can't even imagine. And so, well, then you're sort of like your own widow and your own orphan, but you don't get to say, hey, look, you know, things aren't perfect yet because I'm actually having still quite a rough time here. You don't get to admit to your own suffering. If you can't admit to your own suffering, then you certainly, see, the suffering, especially the additional suffering, the excess suffering, should be treated as evidence that you're not doing something quite right yet. It should be treated as evidence that you're wrong. There's something important that you're doing that's wrong. I understand how harsh that is. And I'm not saying that everyone who's suffering is suffering because they're doing something in some simple way that's wrong. I was in an elevator once in a hospital. It was a very terrifying thing. And this person got on who was just in an absolute state of shock. You know, I mean, it was really not good. And I don't remember how this happened, but I engaged the person in conversation, and they just said that they had just been diagnosed with what looked to be terminal cancer. And what was horrifying about it was that what they were doing was going over their life in the elevator, trying to figure out what they had done in order to deserve such a fate. You know, they'd immediately taken it on themselves as a moral failing. And that's not what I'm saying. You can't come up to someone who has cancer and say, well, if you weren't such a bloody idiot throughout your whole life, you wouldn't have cancer. And believe me, that happens a lot more than you think. And people who have diseases like that get blamed for it. That's not what I'm saying. It's not like that. It's a more generalized attitude that is that if life isn't yet what it should be, then you have a primary responsibility to do something about it. And the place to start looking is to your own errors and to fix them. And that's a safe bet, man, because you're probably doing some things that you wouldn't have to be doing that if you fixed would make things better. So it's time to let go and to sacrifice who you are for who you could become. Well, there's this idea in the Old Testament that your sins might be visited unto your family 7 generations down. Seems kind of harsh. But, you know, when you're confronting, maybe your father's tyrannical. Yeah, but, you know, maybe his father beat the hell out of him. And maybe his father's father was a vicious alcoholic. And you just bloody well don't know how far back that goes. And that means also you don't exactly know what you're dealing with. Right? To some degree you're dealing with your father, but only partly. What you're dealing with is the pathological paternal spirit, something like that. And it's better to think about that way because it becomes an existential issue at that point. You know, so you could say that, well, the father has 2 components, and I mean this psychologically speaking. There's the great father that's beneficial and protective, and that organizes society and teaches you how to speak and has produced all these wonderful things. And then there's the tyrannical, oppressive part of the father. Just like there's the terrible part of Mother Nature that's destructive and the benevolent part of Mother Nature that's wonderful and productive. And you're stuck with that, right? You're stuck with having to mediate between those opposing forces, just like you're stuck with the adversarial part of yourself and the heroic part of yourself. And it's up to you to set those things right. Otherwise, they propagate into the future. And it isn't a straightforward thing to say how to set them right. There's quite a good movie about that. Magnolia, which I really love. It's by Paul Anderson, if I remember correctly. I hope that's right. It's a beautiful movie. And it's about this, part of it's about this kid whose father's really pushing him to be a superstar at a quiz show, right? He's a genius kid, eh? And the kid studies this guy named Charles Fort. You don't understand this movie if you don't know this, because you got to know about Charles Fort to understand Magnolia. Charles Fort was this weird old guy who got rich with an inheritance when he was like 20 and spent the rest of his life in libraries looking up impossible things and documenting them. Impossible things that couldn't happen from a scientific perspective, that were well attested to by multiple observers. And he produced this newspaper called the Fortean Times, which still runs. Anyways, in Magnolia begins with this guy who falls out of a building and then is shot by a woman who misses her husband with a rifle as he falls. And I think she's charged with murder. And the street names have something to do with the deaths and his fall, and all of that happened. And then in the movie, there's a rain of frogs. And there are rains of frogs from time to time. Sometimes they're frozen, sometimes they're rains of fish, sometimes they're frozen. It's like, what the hell? How does that happen? It happens quite frequently, as it turns out. There's a rain of frogs in the movie Magnolia. And this little kid, see, what happened to him is that he's on stage, and he ends up peeing his pants because of the pressure, basically, and humiliates himself. And then there's this rain of frogs, which he kind of takes as a sign from God. And then he goes to his father, even he's like 8 years old, this kid, and he says, you have to stop doing this to me. And he's dead serious about it, very careful, not being, what would you call it, insubordinate, nothing like that. He decides that that's coming to an end right now. And you have to make those decisions in your family, because otherwise things propagate down the generations, right? And every family is rife with pathologies of one form or another. And you can learn from that and refuse to push it forward. And that's part of, I think, what you do when you shoulder your existential burden, because everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of the tyrannical father, just like everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of Mother Nature and of themselves. And so you lock horns with that and straighten it out one way or another, and you don't move it forward to the next generation. So, and maybe you detach it a bit from your parents too, because God only knows what combination of catastrophes culminated in their particular forms of pathology. So now some of the problems with the Marxist perspective seems to be that victimhood, a sense of enhanced victimhood, tends to produce an intense sense of resentment, and that's a very bad idea, because resentment is a very toxic and violent emotion. It's also very ungrateful, which is one of the things I would really say about especially the radical left student types, especially at Ivy League universities. I mean, it's really quite a spectacle to see people at places like Yale come out and agitate as a consequence of the realization of their own oppression, when by any reasonable standard, current or historical, they're probably in the top 1/100%, perhaps better than that, of all the people who have ever lived anywhere, ever. And so it's really quite staggering to me that the top 0.001% can express their resentment about the top 0.0001% in such strident terms without noticing that exactly the same claims of privilege apply to them all you have to do is transform the bin in which you're doing the privilege comparisons, and that becomes immediately self-evident. And the fact that as Americans, let's say, or as North Americans, since I'm a Canadian, that we're staggeringly privileged compared to the rest of the world is certainly a consequence of what you might describe as the arbitrariness of our political borders. And so, but to forget that when you're claiming a particular brand of oppression for yourself seems to me to be very ungrateful at the least, and certainly motivated, let's say, politically, because I think it justifies your expression of hatred for that tiny fraction of people who are still better off than you, and also a degree of historical ignorance that's absolutely staggering in its magnitude, and a complete indictment of our education system, which should be indicted in every possible way. So, now, the Marxists might claim to their benefit, let's say, with this worldview of class struggle as being the primary driver of human history and the well-off socioeconomically, because that's pretty much the only way they define well-off, which is also something I take great objection to, because there's lots of hierarchies in the world, and there are many important hierarchies, and not all of them can be reduced to socioeconomic status by any stretch of the imagination. Imagine if you were 80 years old and you had $20 million, you might be perfectly happy to get rid of all that money if you could be 18 again. So one of the best predictors of wealth in North America is actually age, because young people haven't actually had much time to make money, whereas old people have had quite a bit of time. But the problem with being old and rich is that you're still old. And that actually turns out to be quite a serious problem, because no matter how rich you are, you eventually die. And so the money has a very delimited delimited effect with regards to addressing the fundamental problems of the suffering of life. And we know perfectly well from the empirical perspective that once you have enough money so that the bill collectors aren't chasing you around, essentially, something like the beginnings of a middle class existence or maybe the upper end of the working class, then additional money has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on your psychological well-being. And that's actually an indication of the limitations of material comfort, let's say, as a medication for the suffering that's attendant on life. It's another thing that's very weak about the Marxists, and I think very interestingly contradictory, because they're very anti-capital in their structure, but they're so damn materialistic that it's absolutely mind-boggling, because the Marxists are actually more convinced that money is useful than most capitalists, as far as I can tell, because they believe that money is in fact the solution to all life's problems. The problem is that just the right people don't have the money. And I think that's a staggeringly naive perspective, because there's many problems in life that money just cannot solve, and there's a fair number of them that it actually makes worse. So anyways, having said all that, you could also still make the case. I used to work for a socialist party in Canada when I was a kid, about the time I was 14 till the time I was about 17, before I figured out what was wrong, not so much with socialism per se, but with ideology per se. And I actually admired the socialist leaders that I had the fortune to be introduced to, because at that point they were very much voice for the working class, a lot of union leaders and people like that, you know, so they're classic democratic socialists on the labor end of the distribution. And it's absolutely necessary for labor and the working class to have a political voice, something the Democrats might keep in mind. So, and maybe they wouldn't lose their elections quite so frequently. No, I really think it's appalling, you know, because it's necessary for the working class to have a political voice. So, and to have that transformed into identity politics is a real catastrophe. Anyways, I think that the people that I met, many of them were genuinely concerned with the problems of the working class, and, you know, more power to them. And so I think there are people on the left who genuinely are trying to make a difference for people who could use a fair shot at opportunity in life. But at the same time, I noticed that a tremendous number of especially the lower end worker, party worker, protester types were more peevish and resentful than good-hearted and kind. And it was about that time that I came across George Orwell's famous critique of left-wing thinking in the UK, in a book called Road to Wigan Pier, where he basically made the claim that the socialists that he knew, especially the middle-class ones, didn't give a damn about the poor, they just hated the rich. And that's, I mean, that is something worth thinking about for a very long period of time, because hatred actually turns out to be a very powerful motivation. You know, and if you think about the sorts of things that happened in the Soviet Union and all these places that were supposed to be workers' paradises, if you look at the outcome and you had to infer whether it was goodness of heart and kind-heartedness and care for the working man that produced the genocides, or outright bitter resentment and hatred, it's a lot easier to draw a causal path from the negative emotion to the outcome than from the positive, kind-hearted benevolence to the outcome. You just don't get gulags out of benevolence. That's just not how it works. So I think the bloody historical evidence is clear, although I have read the most convoluted, pathological, pathetic, twisted rationalizations of what happened, say, in Stalinist Russia that you could possibly manufacture. It's as if a stack of corpses that would reach halfway to the moon isn't enough evidence for the pathology of a certain form of belief. So, well, some people can't be convinced by anyone's death but their own, I suppose. You know, the right wing is really hard on the Frankfurt School. You know, in the Frankfurt School were these kind of neo-Marxist guys who combined Marxism with Freudianism in the 1940s, and they were avowed neo-Marxists, you know, so it's not like I'm making an accusation. And they were kind of anti-system type people and all of that. But I think to lay what's happening at the universities and in the broader culture itself at the feet of the Frankfurt School is insufficient. I really think that it's primarily a consequence of the French intellectuals who, and this is obviously an oversimplification, who emerged out of Marxism in the early 1970s and produced postmodernism. Now, the thing about the postmodernist types is they're nested inside Marxism. They say that straight out. I'm not inventing this. You read Derrida, who's like the joker at the head of the postmodernist movement, and I mean joker because he's an intellectual clown, and that doesn't mean he's stupid, because he is not stupid, not at all. These people are not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. They know precisely what they're doing. They're a hell of a lot more educated about what they're doing than you are, unless you happen to be one of them. And they mean exactly what they say, just like people always do when they tell you what they're going to do, or they write it down. And they say straight out on their websites, say the women's studies websites, we think the patriarchy is an oppressive structure that should be broken down to its core, and they mean core conceptions. It's not just social, it's linguistic, philosophical, and attitudinal. It should be broken down, wiped out, and restructured from the bottom up, and they mean that. So when it's not accidental, any of this, and I know it sounds like a bloody paranoid conspiracy theory, but you know, I've always been of the idea, especially from reading Jung, that people don't have ideas have people. And these are powerful ideas. There's a good book called Explaining Postmodernism that I might recommend by a guy named Stephen R.C. Hicks. And his first chapter, which isn't very long, is a good introduction to political correctness. But so why do I think this is about that? Well, here's my reasons. I mean, it doesn't seem to be about me. I think all I did was I made the general specific, which is kind of what you have to do if you really want to make a point. A point, right? That's one place if you want to make a point. And my point was, I'm not saying made-up words generated by postmodern neo-Marxists, because I despise everything they stand for. And so I'm not using those damn words. And that's that. Ideologies are fragmented religions, essentially. They use the same symbolic understructure, but they only tell part of the story. I could give you a quick example of that. I'll do it very quickly. So when the American West was settled, it was settled on the wave of an ideological story. Right. And here's the story. Heroic individual, that's positive, bringing positive culture, that's the wise king, into virgin or into chaotic territory. That's the negative mother, essentially. So that's positive individual, positive culture, negative nature, right? And that's a motivating story, man, to heroically bring order into the untamed wilderness. It's like 1 million people a year from Europe come driven by that narrative. Yep. It's okay, well, here's the counter narrative. Raping and pillaging individual, bringing the desolations of tyrannical culture into the virginal, wonderful, environmental, what do you call it?
Utopia?
Yes, of nature. Yep. It's like, yeah, man, you can get a long way with that story too. Yeah. But they're both half the story. So you just put those two things together, and you have a religious story. It's like, well, the individual is heroic, but also is an adversary, and a cruel adversary at that. Culture is the wise king, but it's also the evil tyrant. And nature is beautiful and wonderful French impressionistic landscape, and cancer, and Anopheles mosquitoes, and elephantiasis. And so if you are properly oriented in the world, you tell yourself both those stories, and you say, oh my God, they conflict. It's like, yeah, they do, man, that's exactly right. Okay. So an ideology just pulls out a subset of the religious characters and says, this is the entire reality. Right. It's like, no, it's not. Right. It's a parasitical meme, right, essentially. An ideology is a parasitical meme on a religious substructure. So I've noticed when I've lived in places, rented or owned, didn't matter, that if there was a part of the place that I hadn't attended to, whatever that might mean, it might have meant cleaned, it might have meant fixed, but it certainly meant at least thoroughly investigated, then that was chaos. It was like the desert, that part. That's a way of thinking about it. It wasn't mine, even if I owned it. It wasn't mine. I had to interact with it before it became mine. And I had to interact with it, and I had to put it in order, and then it became mine. And then to the degree that it became mine and was in order, then I was also put in order. Now you know that because you go into places that make you uncomfortable. And maybe it's your own house. It's highly probable. It's highly probable. I walk into, well, Chinese doctors do this, traditional Chinese doctors. They go into people's place, and they diagnose their health conditions on the balance of yin and yang, chaos and order. They walk into a house. This is easy to do. You walk into a house, There's too much chaos. Hey, you can detect that in no time flat. Everything is out of order and chaotic. You don't even want to be there. You certainly don't want to open the refrigerator. That's for sure. And there are things that should have been done years ago everywhere. And every one of those things is a fight that hasn't happened and something that's been avoided. And you can't even walk in there and maintain your health. As soon as you walk in there, you're sicker than you were when you were outside. And that's one sort of place. And then another sort of place is you go in and you look at the living room, and the person has vacuumed the living room rug, and the lines that were vacuumed are parallel to one another. And the furniture is covered with plastic. And you get a glass of water, and then just as you're going to set it down on the coffee table, the person rushes over and puts a coaster underneath it. And everything in that house says to you that it would be a lot more perfect in that house if you were either not there or dead. And that's the message that the whole house is blasting at you. And if you happen to live there, then you're going to be sick. And what you're going to be sick from is too much order. And in the other house, you're going to be sick from too much chaos. And so, when you interact with a house, the unexplored parts are the chaos the parts that you have not yet contended with are the chaos that has not yet been transformed by your embodied logos action into habitable territory. And it does not belong to you.